welcome to the next episode on trauma sensitivity and psychological safety for coaches.
Clients.
And clients.
Right.
Yes. So this is what you need to pay attention to within yourself and also outside of yourself with your clients so that you know how to manage as and when it comes up. As you know, being in a relationship with a client, in a coach-client relationship, is a very intimate one because the coach, or rather the client, will be sharing stuff that, maybe even their spouses wouldn't hear about. So it becomes imperative that they feel safe enough to share what they need to with you in order to move forward in whichever issue that they bring up. And that's where the psychological safety is built, and that's where you have to be really sensitive to the traumas that they hold so that you do not end up re-traumatizing them. Right, so in this episode or this video, what we're focusing on is your competency 1 and 4. The first one is about how do you conduct yourself in an ethical practice, and also the fourth one is on how do you cultivate trust and safety with your client. So the key thing we want to look at is really on how do you recognize nervous system activation, how do you know when somebody is triggered by their trauma, and when you are seeing signs of emotional overwhelm. And how do you as a coach then support safely without overstepping the boundaries such that it becomes a therapy work that you're doing versus coaching. Yeah. So Ming, I guess this is an area that you're an expert on when it comes to trauma.
I don't really dare to call myself an expert in anything because after all, I'm still a student of life. But then, I do know one thing or two when it comes to conflict resolution. And I think that we need to realize that, we are constantly dreaming about conflicts and wars. The day whereby our traumas are not healed, guess what actually happens? It has to manifest externally as a mirror of what's happening in our internal world.
Yep.
Right, there's a saying called as above, so below, as within, so without. So our external reality matches our internal world itself. And we need to really get comfortable in dealing with conflicts. We need to get really, really, really comfortable with dealing conflicts. So when I talk about conflicts, what do you feel? How do you hear? What do you pick up? What is your first initial response to it? Some people manage conflicts by running away. They do everything in their power to avoid conflict. Some people partake in the conflict itself, believing that will make the relationship get closer. There's no right or wrong answer. There's only appropriateness or inappropriateness depending on the context itself. But first, we have to understand the nature of ourselves. Are we going in to add more conflict, or are we coming in to de-escalate conflict? So my years of work, as a conflict resolution expert itself, doing a lot of conflict resolution work itself, the first thing we have to realize is there is an X energy opposite us, and we have to be able to stand to the other side. But standing on the other side doesn't mean that you have to give up your position, but it allows you to move in a more fluid way. When people are fighting in a very aggressive, fiery way, what do we need most in our life? Water. So that fluidity is always essential to it, because that fluidity always allows us to move from one role to another role. So put into this perspective, if I were to use the paper to actually kind of write it right now, you're standing on one side, and opposite you there's another side, which is the most polarized energy that you're dealing with. Can the person who is standing on this side also realize that, that the conflict that they're facing with the other person is actually them? Now, maybe this sounds a little bit too abstract to handle, but then you standing on this side, you have your opinions in terms of how things work, right? You have your feelings, you have your stance, you have certain value system. Whereas, you would think that the person on the other end is heated up. What do we do? What do we do? How do we move each other? Perhaps a way is to stand in their shoes, monetarily moving into their position to understand what they're really saying, what are they really feeling, what they're hearing. And then being able to stand into this shoe and inviting them to be able to stand into this shoe. So that both people in this whole thing called unified field can start experiencing both directions. But it becomes a problem when we're so fixated that this position is the only truth that can exist. When we believe that something is the only truth that can exist, we're literally saying that we understand the whole universe, the whole world. How can that be true? We barely scratched 1% of this universe. So is it possible for both sides to be real and true at all at the same time?
Yep.
Then the question is, can we move ourselves into each of the role that we are kind of locked up in to be able to move in fluidity? If conflict is about fire, then maybe what we need is more fluidity, water, to create a harmony. Right? Does it make sense?
Yep. Yeah, I think it's very relevant to this whole idea of like building psychological safety for the clients.
Always.
Yeah.
Always. We have to first realize that, hey, no matter what the other person is saying, it is not an attack. It only comes in the form of an attack because we feel it energetically. And why do we feel it energetically? Usually because, there's a lot of awareness around it. Or possibly, there's certain trauma that's getting reenacted. Right? Because when people throw words, it's not just words that come across. There's also certain energy that comes across. And sometimes we just get triggered, we react. But can we for a moment pause that reaction itself and to take a moment to look into this whole field, look into this whole unified energy of what is really happening? Why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? What does it remind me of? Why do I feel triggered in this moment? No, that's one way. But then being able to facilitate a conversation in a group dynamic in a room is a whole different scale, because you also got to invite them to step up from their role into your role. And the best way to actually move that is to move that person. To move that person, the best way is to move yourself. Does it make sense?
Yep.
Right.
It's
So
about moving so that you can see the other side.
that's right. So we always think that conflicts are bad, but we never really take a stand to consider that maybe conflicts are meant to bring greater harmony, greater peace, greater zen, in not just us, but in the whole world itself. We avoid conflict because, as we were growing up, we were told that conflicts are bad. Or we experience certain conflicts watching our parents fight along the way and having conflicts and them not being able to resolve it, and we attribute it to something negative, association, something, misery, suffering, or that kind of negative association. So every time conflicts come, you naturally have a tendency either to participate or to quit. But either way, both are unhealthy because they are locked up in a role, which means that the outcome is also locked up. When you lock up in a role, no matter where you move in your life, you're moving in the lock-up direction that was really set by the role. So how can we free ourselves from this and to be able to welcome more conflicts in our life? Because more conflicts means that you have more things to work on. And that's actually a great thing. If you didn't have any conflicts in your life, why would you work on yourself?
But to begin with, most people already have conflict within themselves, right? They are somewhat suppressed, or even the most peace-looking person has a lot of conflict that they sideline.
That's right. So the first thing we have to realize is get them to do meditation, get them to sit by themselves. Can they really sit still by themselves? Or does their mind start going haywire? Do they start fantasizing stuff? That really tells you that a person is not really at peace. Now, a person who is at peace will not chase after peace because they're at peace. Likewise, conflict itself, we have to use a different lens to look at conflict itself. We have to realize that harmony can be established through conflict. And this is a higher love, principle itself, of how we can actually bring to the table itself. Now, when I talk about safe space, people can curate safe spaces, make the other person feel safe enough to open themselves out. So we're still talking at the very baby level. Then we talk about a little bit about ethics, right? Whether can you hold certain confidentiality when they tell you certain things? Can you make sure whatever private matters that's being discussed is kept at private level? Of course, if the private matters, was used to start out a public event, you have to address that in the public level. But then that's the kind of confidentiality that every coaches need to have. It's like a vault that we have, that we keep those files for each of these different cases. I think a lot of times people can't really uphold that because they are feel called to bond with them based on the kind of experiences that they share. And that is dangerous because you fall into a trap where you're no longer ethical, professional, and also objective. And that's how the relationship starts getting blur. And I'll show you how blur can a relationship be if you don't set boundaries. If you don't set clean, clear boundaries that's based on consensus reality.
Yep.
And when when boundaries are not clear, traumas get spilled over. Each person uses their own trauma and burn each other's back thinking it's acceptable. It is not. It is a recipe for disaster.
So what would you say is a boundary that when a coach doesn't set, then there's a likelihood of spillover from the clients?
Now, in a coach and client relationship, that is already a boundary. I'm the coach, you're the client. We don't get into any other relationship. This is a professional relationship. Let's just handle it objectively. So this is the first frontier of a relationship. But then things always get messy, right? Because other than the coach, all that, sometimes they look up to you as a role model. Sometimes they look up to you as a friend. Maybe you already know each other from a different context itself. So I think it's important to have the awareness to update your files. And when you update these files, it's also important to separate them and put them in the right places so that things don't get messy. Does it make sense?
Yeah. I think I like the part around the boundary setting part.
Right. But every time we talk about boundaries, right, people would think that boundaries is as easy as saying yes, saying no. They are right. But then I think there's more nuances than this. When do we say yes? Because too often time we live in a world whereby people say yes when it's a no, and when people say no, they actually mean a yes. It gets really confusing to navigate around relationships after a certain while. And that really brings the question back. When did we have this pattern of saying yes when it's a no? Where did this pattern come from? Maybe you were forced to do something in the workplace that you didn't really like, and then you actually had to say yes to it because otherwise you would lose your job. But that's not really a real yes. So going back to one of the things that we talk about in another episode itself, really check for feedbacks, check for signals itself. Because a yes is a yes, a no is a no. It needs to be 100% yes. A 70% yes is not a real yes. And oftentimes in my experience when it comes to conflict resolution work as a facilitator, it always leads to more disasters, conflicts, more potentiality. People start fighting. Okay, we have an agreement now. When we talk, how come you're still not doing it? How come you're still not honoring the commitment that we set out to do? Because it wasn't a real yes.
So as a coach, it's really about how do you see or tell or sense into whether this yes or no from your coachee or even from yourself is 100%.
That's right. So, in a coaching itself, when you set up follow-up action, I guess if you can see the feedback of a real yes or a real no, you know whether the client will already done their work. Even before the next session, even before the coaching session actually finishes.
Yeah.
Because the feedback is always the same.
Yeah. So perhaps one way is to look at the cases you've worked with so far, right? To look at when your clients actually do their work, how did they say yes or no? And versus for those who didn't, how were they really saying their yeses and nos? Maybe that will give more clues around how you should tune in and connect to.
Right. The word that you really must connect to is the word but. And the way they sigh. If a person says, yes, I know I should be doing this, but of course they are not. I'm curious why they are not doing it. I'm not going to bring up my own personal values and ethics on the table. Okay, because maybe I value integrity. Okay, so I ask, why you never do your work again? We agree, we have an agreement. I want to come in to understand, okay, we really have an agreement. We really have a firm boundary that was set in place. I want to understand what was not in alignment based on what we shared, based on the things that we agree on. What was it that cannot be reconciled or can be reconciled? Does it make sense?
To reconcile.
Right. So it's the way of being that I carry with me to ask those questions. Okay. We're not here to say, okay, this is black, this is white. They are black and white. But then when boundaries become blur in the first place, it's no longer black and white. It's grey. The colour of shit starts spilling over. Black is not really black. White is not really white. It's a whole different tonality, colour tones. And I think having that sensitivity and awareness is the first step to realize that we don't live in a world of duality where things are either right or is wrong. We live in a world of consensus reality and what was agreed upon. So we always go back to foundation, go back to the agreement. And it's always important to write it down. That's why we have legal system in place, we have lawyers, we have contracts drafted, because we want things to be clear so that the boundaries are made known fundamentally based on consensus agreement. That's why we put things into contract.
Yep.
So that is very important in any relationship, in any communication, in any leadership or team members as well. Even more so when it comes to coaches, because coaching is built on trust. So why not let's follow this? Now that we have addressed conflict. Is this,
I
is
think
this good enough to explain conflict resolution work that we do?
It does. I think perhaps the thing to look at or to address is how does one manage the conflict within, right? As a coach.
Right.
Or even like working with a client through that conflict. I mean, there's the aspect of standing into the position of the other party, so that's helpful.
But you're not really standing, you're not really exchanging position. You are allowing the movement to happen. Right. To explore the different value system in each of this role itself. And really to also examine whether is this really workable? Is this really working out? One needs to change. One needs to die. One needs to reborn. So that there's a whole generative system in play. And ultimately to realize that, hey, there's only a polarity. It's not possible to find someone who's not going to have any conflict with you, because we are fundamentally different to begin with. But having the awareness of ranks and power, having the awareness of the conflict itself, having the awareness of the person's history and trauma, so that you don't burn into the other person consciously. So it brings back the question, how do we make a relationship work? How do we not burn our shit onto each other?
That sounds like a deep question.
What are you thinking?
When you talk about making a relationship work, I mean, most people probably know how to do it on the surface. But then everything seems to be okay, seemingly, on the surface. But if we look at what happens, then if it was all good on the surface, how did relationships begin to have issues later on? Is it a matter of we experienced something that crossed our boundaries or that didn't sit with us, but we accepted it anyway? And in accepting it, it creates an inner conflict because we didn't bring that out into the open to resolve it. So over time, more and more internal conflicts exist within yourself where this relationship is concerned. And that's where the beginning of the end begins.
That's the problem with all relationship. We don't realize all relationship conflict we have in the present time, they are all trauma related. Best part, some people are still in denial that they have traumas. Just because you have a great family, your family barely fight doesn't mean that you don't have trauma. Sometimes trauma can come in the absence of something.
Yeah. Sometimes the fact that there is no obvious conflict being worked on may mean that there's a lot of suppressed conflict that's existing within, and there's just a lot of ignoring of it. And so then the chaos of the conflict then occurs around you.
Right. Chaos.
So in terms of a coach, then how does a coach then work when it comes to this? It's about understanding the degree of inner conflict a person holds and having the sensitivity to see that there are conflicts happening instead of taking what the coachee or client says as when things are all good to be all good, because there's always more that meets the eye. And the problem with why certain coaching sessions don't go as far as it should is because of the naiveness that a coach has in
Tell
terms
me more
of
about that. What do you mean?
meaning that you are taking the client's words at face value. that maybe what the client is saying is what they want you to hear and listen so that you can be on their side. And you know, the most classic trick of how coaches always fall into the stories that the clients give, such that you are seeing the same thing as them and there's no way you can get them out of it because you are caught in the same narrative that they are in.
That's right.
So it's a question of then how do you as a coach become more discerning in the way that you view the client? Is the viewpoint that they gave or give the only viewpoint? Does it tell the full story? Could there be more than meets the eye? It's just like if a person seems peaceful on the outside, are they really all peace? What is the conflict happening within? And how do you then access those aspects of them to understand what's the playing field that you have? And how do you then tread that relationship, that interaction or that topic or session in a way that is sensitive and that allows some of these things that they don't really speak to come up, so that your client begins to tell you what is true versus the story that they want you to hear. That's at least what I'm hearing from our interaction on this topic. Any thoughts?
Well, just thinking about what do the students really need, because this is a very hands-on thing, you know. Usually these are what we call group processes that can only happen in a group setting using a real-time experience. My challenge right now that I'm having is that, you know, I've worked with so much conflicts that I don't really track or try to hold on to them, because once it's past, you know. So oftentimes you ask me what kind of cases I deal with, you know. Unless I talk about memorable ones, but what makes something memorable is because there was a challenge that was presented. Right? You know what I'm saying? That's why it becomes memorable. But after a while, every conflict is kind of the same. So the question is, right, can we have the awareness to realize that, hey, there's really a lot of work we need to do. Even as coaches, you know, you need your own therapy.
Yep.
Because there are some issues you just really can't coach without dealing with your history, your past.
Yeah, that you don't go straight into your own conflict or judgment when you hear a client say something that mirrors what you've been through before or are going through in real time.
And I think it's good to pay attention to your nervous system. Reaction, triggers, they're not in the brain, they're in the nerve. The people who live in the war zones themselves, they're always constantly up their guard, vigilant, because one wrong move, their life could be gone. That's survival.
Yep.
The survival mechanism itself. And oftentimes, when you pay attention to a person itself, the body speaks. Pay attention to their nervous system. Pay attention to what makes them trigger, why they're reacting. Pay attention to the change in their tonality, the change in their voice, the change in their skin color, the way they blink the eye, the way they move their eyebrow, the way they frown, the way they scratch their neck. Pay attention to every details. Just because you see something doesn't mean that you have to associate a meaning to it. But yes, there is a meaning to it, but the meaning is not what you think it is. It is about the client. It is about the client. It is about the client. So coaches, you must remember this. Don't take things personally. It's never about you. You are just a mirror, a conduit for the client to face themselves. And it's important not to hook each other up into each other's high dream.
What is a high dream?
A high dream is like a hopeful dream, a desire that we have, a hopeful wish that we have. And usually it stems from hopelessness of what we experienced in our childhood. And therefore that becomes a high dream that we wish for it to happen. So I'll give you an example. Maybe my entire life, you know, I've been trying to look for a person, you know, to be with. Always feeling, you know, one of the original trauma that we all have is the trauma of separation itself. The first separation didn't happen just between the child and the mother. The first separation happened even before we came into this world. Right? And then, of course, the trauma get amplified between the mother and the child, which creates this whole fear of abandonment. Right? Most people are scared to be abandoned, but they never really understood and examined where did this abandonment come from. Of course, their history. But which aspect of the history? The first separation happened to a baby is when they were cut off from the biblical cords, you know, from the mom.
Yep.
Right. So mom become a figure, a central figure, the divine feminine. And the child spend their entire life trying to chase after the figures of the mom. Even a rejection is a chase, right? And no matter what you reject, you're still in the same path. It's only it's only two different sides of the same coin. So having that awareness of information, histories, context, okay, we need to start paying attention to read cues. First, you have to read your own cue. Are you giving a double signal? Do you say yes when it's a real yes, or do you say yes when it's a no? Okay, what are the things that you miss? What are the feedbacks and signals that you miss at the early stage? Because any feedbacks and signal you miss from the other person, it usually tells you an aspect of yourself that has a hole that you need to work on. A high dream is something that we wish that would happen, right? And the low dream, contrary to that, is when the high dream is not met and you got fall flag. The whole expectation that this high dream will happen, but it did not happen. So what happens to a person? They fall flat. So that's low dream. Understanding the way dream works gives us perspective on how to navigate relationship, how to navigate our deepest desire. Some people, every time they make a progress, they are looking for something to sabotage themselves. So the symptom is a self-sabotage of what they're doing. But the deeper level is which part of themselves do they not agree that they could be successful. They could get whatever dream they want. So usually that already signifies a conflict within themselves. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
So you must realize that psychological safety is not comfort. We're not here to make people comfortable. In fact, our role is to bring out the uncomfort and discomfort in people so that they can examine their life. And change is a very uncomfortable process. Transformation is about death.
Yeah.
It's about overcoming our own psychological barriers, our psychological edges, again and again and again, so that we go higher and higher and higher in our development, in our mastery, in our actualization. Right? So it's also important to also know when to stop coaching. Okay? For example, a client system is overwhelmed. What do we do? Okay? How do you handle cases when you notice that your client dissociate, they freeze, or they spiral down, or they start looping? Okay, when do you pause? How do you pause? Okay, the how is as important as when, right? Timing is one, but how you deliver it is also critically important because that facilitates regulation, right? How do you recognize that the coaching needs to stop so that we can bring the whatever issue that comes up to the next session itself? All these things, is very meta-based. It's very filled with nuances. Okay, so I think it's also important to realize that, hey, you can't coach a person just here. You're going to coach them at the body. And the body is already a giveaway telling signs. Okay. And how do you respond to it when your client react in a particular way? Say, your client is overwhelmed. What do you do? Do you rush? Do you rescue? Do you try to intellectualize, or do you try to shut down? Do you stay grounded as a coach when your client can't do that? How do you regulate yourself? So I bring the needs back to the coaches again. For the coaches to start exploring how to set up systems within themselves such that they themselves can regulate, they themselves can feel the safety. Because, if you're operating based on survival mechanism, you can't really coach effectively. You're just entering in a new war zone with a client.
Yep. So safety doesn't equal to comfort. You can be safe and uncomfortable at the same time. Safe because you know that, safe because the coachee know that you have their backs.
That's right.
You'll be here to really facilitate them to where they need to go.
That's right.
But then it takes going through that discomfort. Because as they always say, right, you can't get a breakthrough without a breakdown.
Oh, that's my line.
Yes.
So I think it's also important, right, to know that your job as a coach is not to fix the issue of the client. Your job is not to treat the client. If you think that that's your role, then I think you're going to go back to your basic ethics of a coach. Because the role of a coach is to coach. Okay, the role of a fixer is to fix. The role of a therapist is to do therapy. Okay, and it's important to know that when the boundaries are crossed or blur, and you're going to stop it before it becomes too late. Okay, you want to reverse the thing before it becomes irreversible.
Yep.
Okay, having that trauma-informed awareness becomes critically important because you know the person history, you know your personal history, you make sure that they never spill into each other coaching session itself. Okay, and if you want to process the trauma, take it outside of the coaching session. But the coaching session literally is what is presented that the person actually needs to work on.
Correct. So in the coaching session itself, in terms of working with trauma-informed aspects of the client, it's really about building the awareness. Them knowing that, okay, if it's outside reaction, is it just a present time thing? Or is that the past that's being brought up, is being layered on, and that the force of the entire trauma is actually coming out as part of the reaction in the present time?
Right.
The ability to recognize that the past is happening in the present allows them to actually separate the present and the past such that they can move forward without the weight of the past weighing to that degree. And with that, it allows them to also build healthier relationships or even break free of their traumas at some point.
That's right.
Because of that separation work.
That's right. So we're going to ask about responsibility. What is your role? What is your duty? What is the responsibility of the coach?
Yep.
And what is the role, the responsibility of the client itself? Now, don't be worried about traumas, okay? First and foremost, when a client gets triggered, they get reactive. Just pay attention to what they get triggered about, because triggers are signals.
Yeah, signals.
They are not instructions. Okay, don't get response. Most people fumble when they catch a client getting triggered. They don't know what to do, so they start operating based on their default path itself, and their default path comes out from all that unclean stuff, from their own childhood history. So that's a bad way to go. So recognize that a trigger is actually a signal in terms of how you approach the relationship. How do you acknowledge it? How do you get your client to acknowledge it? How do you acknowledge it as a coach without trying to dig into their history? Okay, how does insight happen without reliving the past? And what is beyond insight, such that by revisiting the past can possibly help to resolve the present time issue that they came with wanting to work on? I think these are many questions that we really need to think about as a coach. Okay, and what does it mean to honor the signal without trying to activate the wound or to rub salt on the wound? Because we're not here to make the other person wrong, but we really want to find a way to dance around it. Okay, so when is it the right time to increase the rhythm, to move at a certain speed, either to quicken the session itself or to slow down the session itself? And I think these are the whole art of dynamics of relationship.
Yep. So I guess when you look at regulating the client, the whole idea of trauma sensitivity and psychological safety, it still requires your presence as a coach, that awareness and presence you have and that you put to what's within and outside of the coachee to be able to move them in such a way that they are comfortable in what they are putting out to you, and that you're also comfortable in regulating what they have for you, because sometimes our coaches might share stuff that is unexpected. Right, especially when they have
nuclear bomb.
Yes, when they've begun to become comfortable with you and are ready to bring up the deeper stuff that you didn't expect that they were facing.
Right. Build a healthy relationship with your coach-client relationship. Keep it clean. Don't ever get into a romantic relationship where the session is ongoing, because you know that that's not objective. Okay, so it's the same thing as, talking about the ethics of the coach, the ethics of a therapist. It's the same thing. It's the same shit.
Yep. And knowing when the client is bringing out a trauma and bring that awareness to them so that they can separate it clearly, and so that you can also separate it clearly without re-traumatizing.
If the client can't see, then it is your responsibility as a coach to call it out, and it is also your responsibility to pull the plug out if it's not going to work out. So remember what you're here to do. Remember what you're being paid to do. Don't mix the lines up. When lines get messy, relational conflicts become even messier. The dreaming of each other's end has already begun.
Yep. Yes, so as a coach, there's really a lot you need to deal with within yourself and outside of yourself. So I think in terms of living this off, you really want to ask yourself about how you set boundaries.
Right.
Is that something you set? And when you say a yes, is that truly a yes? When it's a no, is it truly a no?
Right.
Because sometimes your clients may overstep your boundaries without you realizing. But then what makes it difficult for you to say no? Perhaps, you have a people pleaser tendency. Or perhaps there are other reasons that, you feel that it's not safe to say yes or to say no. Then perhaps that's where you need to work on safety for yourself first before you even talk about bringing safety to others.
That's right. And psychological safety is not about making another person feel good or comfortable. It is about knowing when to go fast, when to go slow, when to stop, and when your presence is fully present. Remember that.
Yeah. So with that, I hope that gives you the food for thought you need in order to manage yourself better and to bring that safety and sensitivity to your clients in sessions.
Sayonara, arigato.
Yes.